The air inside the underground Allied code room felt tight, almost heavy, like the whole building was holding its breath. It was late, close to midnight, but no one dared to stop working. The machines clacked, papers shuffled, and pencils scratched across notepads. Every few seconds, another encrypted enemy message arrived, full of strange symbols and numbers that no one could understand. The codebreakers were tired. Their eyes hurt. Their hands shook. But the pressure kept growing, because out in the dark Atlantic Ocean, hundreds of miles away, a line of Allied ships was sailing straight into danger. A young officer stared at the giant wall map. Red pins marked enemy submarines, silent German U-boats waiting under the waves. The officer whispered, "If we don't crack this message, they're done." His voice was thin and scared. Everyone heard him, even though no one looked up. They all knew he was right. A whole convoy of ships, carrying food, medicine, and soldiers, was heading toward a trap they couldn't see. And the only way to warn them was hidden inside a message no one could read. A loud thud suddenly echoed through the room. A folder had slipped from a table and burst open on the floor. Papers flew everywhere. A tired decoder groaned and bent down to pick them up. As he reached under the table, his hand brushed against something soft. An old, worn notebook tied with a thin string. It must have fallen out of someone's coat earlier. The cover was scratched, the corners bent, and faint pencil lines peeked out from the edges of the pages. The decoder opened it without thinking. Inside were strange drawings, shapes, loops, swirls, and circles packed so tightly the pages looked alive. "Whose is this?" he called out. No one answered. He flipped another page and froze. The shapes weren't just drawings, they looked familiar. Too familiar. He grabbed one of the enemy code sheets and laid it next to the sketchbook. His heart jumped. The patterns were similar, almost identical. He called for the lead officer, who rushed over and frowned. "Where did this come from?" the officer asked. The decoder shook his head. I don't know, but look." He pointed at the shapes. "These marks match the repeated symbols in the message. It's the same pattern." The officer's eyes widened just for a moment. He wasn't sure what he was seeing, or if exhaustion was playing tricks on them. Still, the room suddenly felt even quieter, as if the machines had paused to listen. The officer whispered, "This shouldn't be possible." The refugee who owned the sketchbook wasn't even in the building. They weren't a soldier or a spy or a trained expert. Their drawings weren't supposed to matter. They were just pencil marks in a torn notebook, nothing more. But as the officer ran his finger along the strange shapes, his voice dropped to a hush. "If these drawings really match the code, this changes everything." No one knew it yet, but a forgotten sketchbook lying on a cold bunker floor was about to save hundreds of lives. A simple book that everyone ignored was holding the key to a secret no machine had cracked. A key the Allies needed right now, before the convoy sailed into the dark and vanished forever. Long before the sketchbook ever touched the floor of an Allied code room, it belonged to someone who never imagined it could change a war. His name was Elias Novak. He was 16 when everything he knew vanished. His home, a small town in Eastern Europe, had been filled with quiet hills, narrow streets, and the sound of church bells on Sunday mornings. But when soldiers marched in, everything changed. Families packed bags in the dark. Doors slammed. People whispered about escape. Elias didn't understand all of it, He just knew he had to run. He carried almost nothing: a thin coat, a stale piece of bread, and the one thing he refused to leave behind: his sketchbook. It wasn't fancy. The cover was peeling, the pages wrinkled from being pressed under pillows and shoved into pockets. But to Elias, it was more than paper. It was his memory, his safety, his only way to make sense of a world that suddenly felt broken. Elias had always drawn things that didn't seem important to other kids: patterns, roof shapes, windows, street cracks, shadows, the way train tracks curved as they disappeared around a bend. His mother used to smile and call him her little map maker. But Elias didn't draw maps, not real ones. He liked drawing the little details no one else noticed: a chipped brick, a crooked fence, the swirling design on an old iron gate. He filled page after page with shapes, lines, symbols, and patterns that made perfect sense to him, even if no one else understood. When soldiers moved closer to his town, Elias and his family tried to hide. But one terrible night, they were forced to scatter. Elias ran with a crowd of other refugees, pushed along in the cold rain, tripping on stones and mud. He clutched his sketchbook tight under his shirt, afraid it might fall, afraid he might lose the one thing that reminded him of home. At border camps and train stations, people lost bags, papers, and sometimes even hope. But Elias never let the sketchbook out of his sight. He slept on hard floors in crowded rooms where everyone spoke different languages. He stood in long lines where people cried quietly as they waited for food. Days blended together. Sometimes he didn't know what country he was in, but every night, no matter how dark or loud the shelter was, he opened his sketchbook and drew. Not because he wanted to make something pretty, but because drawing helped him breathe. It helped him feel alive. One day, after weeks of walking and riding in dusty trucks, Elias crossed into Allied territory. A kind officer who spoke a little of his language guided him to a refugee center. They gave him warm soup, a blanket, and a place to sleep. For the first time in months, he felt safe. He didn't know it, but that sketchbook tucked under his pillow, the one thing he saved from his old life, was about to become the most important book in the entire war. While he sat alone at a metal table, quietly sketching shapes he thought only he cared about, the world was turning. And soon the same lines he drew to survive his fear would help thousands of people survive something far worse. Across the ocean, far from the refugee camps and crowded shelters, another battle was happening. One without guns or explosions, but just as dangerous. It took place in quiet rooms filled with machines, wires, and long tables covered in strange papers. These papers were enemy messages, sent across radio waves in secret codes. The Allied forces could hear the messages. They could record them. But they couldn't understand a single word. Every day, new sheets arrived, covered in odd symbols, numbers, and scattered marks that made no sense. Some messages looked short and simple. Others stretched across whole pages. But they all had one thing in common: no one could crack them. Smart men and women worked night and day, trying everything they knew. They counted symbols, they tested machines, they searched for patterns. But nothing worked. It was like trying to read a language from another planet. The enemy had created a code so tricky, so twisted, that even the best codebreakers felt helpless. One officer slammed his fist on the table. "It's impossible," he growled. But they all knew it couldn't be impossible. Lives depended on it. Every message they failed to decode meant danger. A ship could be attacked. A town could be bombed. A group of soldiers could walk into a trap without ever knowing it was there. One message in particular caused more worry than all the others. It was longer than usual, filled with repeating symbols that didn't repeat in any normal way. It arrived early in the morning, buzzing through the radio wires like a cry for help. The code team gathered around it, frowning, whispering, shaking their heads. The room felt colder, as if the message itself carried bad news. A young decoder pointed at a paper. "These marks here, they look random. Why would the enemy send nonsense?" An older man rubbed his tired eyes. "They wouldn't. Not at this stage of the war. Whatever this says, it's important." He tapped the page again, "But I can't find the pattern." That was the real problem. Codes always have patterns, even if they are hidden. But this one looked like it was made from scattered puzzle pieces that didn't fit together. On the surface, it looked like gibberish, but deep inside, something was there, something big, something dangerous. The team tried everything. They tried lining up the symbols in rows and columns. They tried counting how many times each mark appeared. They compared it to older messages. They even checked if it matched known enemy ciphers. Nothing. Hour after hour passed. Stress filled the room like smoke. A radio operator rushed in with a report. An Allied convoy was getting close to an area known for enemy ambushes. If the message contained a warning or a trap, they needed to know right now. But the code didn't care about pressure. It didn't care about fear. It sat on the table, quiet and stubborn, refusing to share its secrets. The machines hummed, the pencils scratched, the clock ticked louder and louder. Still, nothing broke. What the codebreakers didn't know, not yet, was that someone far away, someone with no uniform or rank, had already drawn the answers they needed. Not in a lab, not on a chalkboard, but in a simple refugee's sketchbook. Elias had been living at the refugee center for only a few weeks when everything began to change. Though he didn't notice it at first. The center was a busy place. People came and went all day. Some were families looking for new homes. Some were soldiers delivering food or medicine. Others were officers asking questions, trying to understand what the refugees had seen or heard during their long journeys. Elias usually stayed in the corner, quiet, drawing in his sketchbook the way he always did. One chilly morning, he sat near a window, sketching the twisted shapes of tree branches outside. His pencil moved fast, making loops and swirls the way his hand naturally wanted to. A few people walked past him, but no one paid much attention. After all, it was just a boy drawing in a notebook. Nothing important, nothing special. But someone did notice. A young Allied clerk named Thomas was carrying a stack of papers down the hall when he accidentally dropped them. They slid across the floor and stopped right near Elias's feet. Thomas bent down to gather them and saw the open sketchbook on Elias's lap. At first he didn't think much of it, just strange drawings. But then his eyes widened. He froze. He leaned closer. Those shapes, those swirls, those repeating marks. He had seen them before, on enemy code sheets. Where did you learn to draw these?" Thomas asked softly. Elias looked up, confused. "They are just things I remember," he said in his broken English. "Just patterns from home." Thomas took a deep breath. He didn't want to scare the boy, but his hands were suddenly shaking. He pointed at one of the pages filled with tight, twisting lines. "May I take this?" he asked. Elias held the notebook closer to his chest, nervous. "It's all I have," he whispered. Thomas quickly knelt down. "No, no, I don't want to keep it. Just show it to someone. It might help. It might help a lot." Elias studied his face and slowly nodded. Thomas carefully lifted the sketchbook and hurried down the hallway. His footsteps echoed louder and louder as he reached the restricted area of the building, the place where messages, codes, and secrets were handled. Inside the code room, officers were arguing again. They were stuck, tired, and running out of time. Thomas burst in. I think you need to see this," he said breathlessly. The lead officer frowned. "Unless that's the enemy code cracked, we don't have time for distractions." "Sir," Thomas insisted, "I think it is part of the code." He placed the sketchbook gently on the nearest table. The officers leaned over it, confused at first. Then the room went silent. The drawings weren't random. They were shapes repeated again and again, just like the marks in the enemy message. One officer grabbed a sheet from the pile and held it next to the sketchbook. The match was undeniable. "How could a refugee child know this?" someone whispered. Thomas didn't answer. He didn't know. No one did. But suddenly the impossible code didn't seem impossible anymore. Far away from the battlefield, far away from machines and war rooms, a boy who had lost everything had carried the one thing the Allies needed most, a pattern no one else had seen. And he had carried it in a simple, priceless sketchbook. The officers gathered around the table like scientists studying a strange creature. They flipped through page after page of Elias's sketchbook, their eyes widening as they compared each drawing to the enemy code sheets scattered across the room. At first, they thought it might be a coincidence. Maybe the boy just liked drawing swirls and shapes, but the deeper they looked, the clearer it became. These weren't random doodles. They were patterns, real patterns, patterns that matched the hidden symbols inside the enemy messages. One officer tapped a page with his finger. "Look at this curve here," he said. "It's the same sequence that keeps showing up in the coded transmissions." Another officer leaned closer. "And this repeated circle shape. It matches the cycle that shows up every 7 lines in the cipher." The men exchanged confused looks. Machines had failed. Experts had failed. But a boy with a pencil had drawn exactly what they'd been missing. Elias stood quietly near the door, twisting his hands nervously. He didn't understand why everyone was so excited. He didn't know anything about codes or ciphers or secret messages. He only knew how to draw what he remembered. Shapes on walls, carvings on the old buildings, symbols used by groups of people trying to stay hidden from danger. A kind-looking officer walked over to him. "Elias," he said gently, "can you tell us why you draw these shapes?" Elias shrugged. "They are everywhere at home," he said softly. "On doors, on signs, on secret places people used. Sometimes they meant safe, sometimes danger. Sometimes only certain people knew how to read them." The officer's breath caught. That was it. That was the missing piece. The enemy had copied secret patterns used by underground groups, resistance fighters, and hidden networks back in Europe. Patterns Elias had seen every day, patterns he thought were ordinary. patterns that no machine would ever recognize, only someone who had lived through them. "Can you help us find the order in the code?" the officer asked. Elias hesitated, then nodded. They brought him to a large table covered in maps and papers. They placed the code sheets in front of him. Elias studied them the same way he studied his own drawings. Slowly, he began to point. "This symbol here," he said, touching a triangle-like mark, "means north in the old street signs in my town." The officers exchanged a shocked look. "And this one," Elias continued, tapping a strange curved line, "means 3 days." People used it when planning to move secretly. Piece by piece, the room came alive. The code was no longer confusing. It wasn't random. It wasn't impossible. It was a hidden language Elias had grown up seeing in the shadows. The officers rushed to gather more sheets. They held their breath as Elias matched each symbol to a meaning. Soon he showed them how the enemy repeated certain marks to show time, distance, or danger. The officers scribbled notes as fast as they could. A pattern formed. A path opened. The code started to break. For the first time since the war began, the enemy's secret messages made sense. One officer whispered, "Machines couldn't see it, but this boy could." Another added softly, "His drawings weren't just drawings. They were the key." While the rest of the world saw chaos on the page, Elias saw home, its hidden corners, its warnings, its secret marks people once used to survive. Now those same marks were about to help the Allies survive too. The room buzzed with energy as Elias pointed from symbol to symbol, unlocking pieces of a puzzle no machine had been able to solve. Every time he spoke, officers hurried to write down his words. Every time he traced a shape with his finger, another part of the enemy's message made sense. Soon the entire code sheet, once a wall of confusing marks, began to look like a map, clear, sharp, and frightening. One officer suddenly gasped, "This message, it's not just a warning, it's a plan." Everyone leaned closer. Elias tapped a spot on the page. "This symbol here means waiting, and this one," he added, touching a crooked swirl, "means underwater. Together, they used to mean a danger near rivers back home." The officer swallowed hard. "Near water. Underwater. U-boats." Another officer checked the giant wall map. "There's only one place this could describe," he whispered. "The convoy route." A cold silence fell over the room. For days, the codebreakers had feared the enemy was setting a trap for the Allied ships out in the Atlantic. Now Elias had confirmed it, and the ships were getting closer to the danger every minute. "Send a radio warning," the lead officer said urgently. "Redirect the convoy, now." A radio operator grabbed his headset, twisting the dial with shaking hands. The message shot across the ocean, carried by static and hope. Out in the dark waters, captains listened. Orders changed. Ships turned. Engines rumbled through the darkness as the entire convoy switched direction. Hours passed. The code room waited, barely breathing. Then a new message arrived, this time from the convoy itself. A cheerful crackle came through the speakers. "No enemy contact. All ships safe." The feeling in the room was like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. Shoulders relaxed. People smiled for the first time in days. Someone clapped Elias gently on the back, surprising him. He'd never been praised by so many adults at once. He lowered his head, embarrassed but proud. But the good news didn't stop there. Over the next few weeks, Elias continued working with the officers. Every enemy message now came straight to him. He sat at the big table, pencil in hand, sketchbook open beside him, decoding symbols faster than anyone else could. The code that once terrified the Allies was no longer a mystery. With every pattern Elias recognized, the enemy lost another advantage. One cracked message revealed where a hidden submarine refueling point was. Another warned of a planned attack on a supply train. A third helped Allied pilots avoid an ambush that would have destroyed a whole squadron. Each time lives were saved because a boy saw meaning where others only saw marks. Officers who once trusted only machines now trusted Elias more. "He sees the code like a story," one of them said, "as if he already knows how it ends." Word spread quietly through the intelligence community. Some called Elias the Sketchbook decoder. Others called him the boy who sees patterns. No one outside the base knew his name, but inside those walls, he became a secret hero. Still, Elias never bragged. He never asked for anything. Every night he just sat on his bunk, holding his sketchbook against his chest the way he had during his long journey. And every night he wondered the same thing. How could something he saved from his old life, a simple, worn notebook, now be helping save so many people in this new world? The officers knew the truth. The codebreakers knew it too. The war had changed because a refugee boy had carried a sketchbook instead of giving up. And the enemy had no idea that their greatest secret was falling apart, not from machines or spies, but from the pencil marks of a boy they never even knew existed. When the war finally began to turn in the Allies' favor, the giant code room slowly grew quieter. The radios buzzed less often. The enemy messages came fewer and farther between. And the officers who once lived on coffee and worry finally slept full nights again. Victory wasn't there yet, but it was close enough to feel. And hidden deep inside that victory were the pencil marks of a quiet boy named Elias, though almost no one outside the intelligence building ever knew it. When the fighting slowed, many of the special teams were broken apart. Some officers were sent to new posts. Some went home. Some were told never to speak of their work again. Everything Elias had done, every pattern he uncovered, every message he saved, was sealed inside top-secret files. No medals, no interviews, no newspaper stories, just folders locked in a drawer, stamped with red ink that said, "Classified." Elias didn't complain. He didn't even expect anyone to thank him. To him, helping the Allied officers had felt right, like paying back the kindness of the people who saved him when he had nowhere else to go. But still, when the time came for the refugee center to close and families to move on, a small part of him wondered if anyone would even remember what he had done. One afternoon, an officer approached him with a gentle smile and handed him a small brown envelope. Inside were papers allowing him to stay in the country and go to school. "You earned this," the officer said quietly. Elias nodded, holding the envelope close, but he didn't know what to say. The officer didn't mention the code breaking. He wasn't allowed to. He simply saluted, then walked away. Elias left the base with nothing more than a backpack, a new set of clothes, and his old sketchbook, the pages now filled with both his memories and symbols that once held deadly secrets. He moved in with a foster family, learned English better, and went to school. He made friends who never knew he had helped save whole convoys. He grew up in a world that never heard his story. Years passed. People forgot the strange patterns that once filled the code rooms. Machines got faster. New wars began in other parts of the world. The files with Elias's name were moved from drawer to drawer, then placed in a box, then stored in a basement archive where dust covered everything. Time hid his work so well that even the officers who had been there barely spoke of it. But his sketchbook survived. Museum workers sorting through old war items sometimes found strange drawings tucked inside folders. They didn't know who made them. They didn't know that those little swirls once saved hundreds of lives. They simply placed them in boxes labeled miscellaneous papers and moved on. Elias grew older. He got a job, raised a family, and lived a quiet life. He never bragged about the past, never told stories of the secret room where he once helped crack codes that experts couldn't solve. Sometimes late at night he would open his old sketchbook and run his fingers over the drawings. He remembered hiding from soldiers, walking across muddy roads, and holding this very book close so it wouldn't get wet. He remembered the faces of the officers as the code finally made sense, and he smiled. History didn't write his name in big letters. No statues were made for him. No school textbooks told his story. But somewhere deep in an old archive, inside a dusty box no one had opened in years, were the messages he helped solve, and the sketchbook that made it all possible. And even if the world forgot, the truth stayed alive in the pencil lines of a boy who once survived by drawing the only language he knew. A language that ended up saving lives. Many years after the war ended, long after the soldiers went home and the code rooms were emptied, a quiet museum worker named Mr. Harlan walked through a storage room filled with dusty boxes. His job was simple: sort old papers, label them, and send them to the right shelves. Most days were the same: old maps, faded photos, broken radio parts. Nothing surprising, nothing special. But one rainy afternoon, he opened a plain cardboard box that had no label at all. Inside were stacks of old war documents, reports, letters, code sheets, and tucked between two folders was a small, worn sketchbook with a thin string still wrapped around it. The cover was faded brown, and the corners were soft, like someone had held it many times. When he opened it, he saw page after page of strange shapes and swirling lines. They looked like maps, almost like tiny puzzles drawn by hand. Mr. Harlan frowned. "What is this?" he whispered. Something about the drawings felt important, not like art, but like clues. He carried the book to his desk, opened an old file, and froze. Inside the file were enemy code sheets from 1943, symbols, loops, and marks that looked almost exactly like Elias's pencil lines. He leaned back in his chair, shocked. "This boy," he whispered, touching the page gently. "Whoever he was, he helped us." He didn't know Elias's name. It wasn't written anywhere. The reports didn't say refugee boy or sketchbook helper. They only said things like patterns discovered, breakthrough achieved, or enemy cipher decoded. The real story, the human part, was missing, lost, forgotten. But the truth was right there in the pencil marks. As Mr. Harlan studied the drawings, he began to understand something important. These weren't just shapes. They were a bridge between two worlds, the world Elias had fled from and the world he helped save. His memories became maps. His fear became strength. His drawings became a secret weapon. And no one had ever told his story. Across the museum, school children walked past old tanks and airplanes, pointing and laughing. None of them knew that sometimes battles were won by people who didn't wear uniforms, people who didn't fire guns, people whose only tool was a pencil and a brave heart. A few days later, Mr. Harlan placed the sketchbook inside a glass case next to the code-breaking display. He added a small sign that read, "Sketchbook used in wartime decoding efforts. Artist unknown. Believed to be created by a refugee who assisted Allied intelligence." Visitors stopped to stare. Some pressed their hands to the glass. They saw the marks, the lines, the careful strokes. And they wondered who made them. Maybe a child. Maybe someone scared. Maybe someone who lost everything, but still chose to help. If only they knew the full truth. The truth that a simple sketchbook once redirected ships in the middle of a dark ocean. The truth that a frightened boy once saved lives without ever stepping onto a battlefield. The truth that sometimes the biggest miracles begin with the smallest hands. Today, the world remembers the big heroes, commanders, pilots, soldiers. But hidden inside one quiet glass case is a reminder that heroism isn't always loud. Sometimes it hums softly like a pencil on a page. Sometimes it hides in patterns only one person can see. Sometimes it comes from someone who had every reason to give up, but chose to hope instead. And if you ever visit that museum and see the sketchbook, ask yourself, which is more surprising? That a child cracked a secret code, or that history almost forgot him? Tell us what you think in the comments.